Hello everyone and welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today I have thoughts. So I'm going to try something a little bit different. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to kind of experiment with it this year and see what I do with it. The thing is, occasionally there are some books that, as you have observed, I have a lot to say about things that a lot of things I want to talk about. Many times in my weekly wrap-ups when I'm talking about books, I don't even scratch the surface of all of the things I'm thinking about these books. And one whole reason that I started my booktube channel is so that I could spew these words, these things I'm thinking, like almost think out loud, right? Also in my bio, describing what I mean by being in search of wonder. One of the things that I want to pursue is, thinking deeply about some things, not everything all the time, but just things that are really worth thinking about. And a really good story is one of those things. So today, as promised in my last weekly wrap up, I want to spend a little time digging into what I'm thinking about this book, The Price of Privilege series by Jessica Dada, which from the very first time that I read it, I have just wanted to talk about it to someone. I remember talking about it incessantly to my husband, talked the poor guy's ears off. His eyes were glazed over and he was like, okay. So now I'm going to inflict it on you, but you have the power to scroll on by and walk away. So that power is granted to you, and I will commence. So first of all, a couple of disclaimers. I'm calling this series or this type of video Deep Thoughts. I'm fully aware that what might be deep as an ocean to me is a shallow creek that someone else wades in. So take that with a grain of salt, okay? Deep thoughts for me, not necessarily for you. Secondly, I know many people, it doesn't bother me personally, but many people strongly dislike being spoiled in what a story is about. So I am aware of that. And I will do my very best not to spoil the story until the very end. There are some things that you can't fully talk about a book unless you're talking about, the things that happen in the book. So at the very end, I will have a chapter that is a marked spoiler. I will stop before then and give you ample time to stop the video and move on so that you are not spoiled by anything, hopefully. That's my goal. So without further ado, I just want to spend a little time just talking through all the things that I have been thinking about this book in the past couple of days, past couple of weeks really, as I was reading it, and then after I finished it and what I was thinking about, the things I have been thinking about since the very first time I read the book, etc. So to start with, let's talk about the characters in this story. Okay, every story is really about the characters, right? So we start with Julia, and Julia is writing this story towards the end of her life, looking back. So she's writing it as an older woman, and she's thinking back to her time when she was very young, like 16, 17 years old, when all of the things in this story happened. And there's a lovely quote, I think it's from the beginning of the second book, where she is saying this as an old woman. She's looking back and she says, "Long life has its advantages. Your perception grows clearer, even if your sight dims." And so she's able to look back at what happened to her as a young person with more clarity, and to be able to really understand what was going on in her life. So as an old woman, she's telling the story, but the story is about the young Julia. And Julia is 16, 17, 18 years old through the course of the story. She is very strong-willed, and she's very independent, and she is desirous of making a way for herself, regardless of what it costs to herself or to others. She just wants to forge and make a path for herself, and she is strongly resistant to the idea of anyone interfering in her life and telling her what to do. She wants to make her own decisions. She is ultimately very self-absorbed. And then we have, now she is the heroine of the story, so that creates issues for some people who strongly dislike the representation of her character, especially since it seems to last most of the way through the book. But I promise you, if you start this series, make yourself read to the end, because the end ties everything together. And I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end until the very end of this video, but read it to the end. There is character development, there is growth, all of that happens, but it takes the whole series to get there. Anyway, that's our heroine. And then we have the thing that she really wants, which is really a person, and that is her childhood friend, Edward, the only person that she feels like who has ever loved her. And she is desperate to fulfill their childhood promise. Well, not childhood. Oh, I guess childhood. Like I guess they were about 15 years old when they promised themselves to each other to get married at some point. And at that time, Edward was probably like 18 years old, but she was like 14, 15 years old, really not old enough to make such a promise. But she considers herself engaged to Edward. And so she is going to do whatever it takes to make that happen, because that's what she really wants out of her life. Edward is an interesting character and a bit of a dichotomy. He is very strong-willed also. He has a very fierce, almost argumentative personality, not unlike Julia. They're very similar to each other. And he is very much, he's, at the time of this, that the story starts, he has become a vicar, although the whole thing is set in England, part in London and part in, the countryside of England. And he's set as a vicar in an Anglican church, but really he comes across much more as a nonconformist to me, like maybe a Methodist. But he's set within the context of the Anglican church because that works best with the story. So with the plot. So he is a vicar, but imagine more of like a very passionate Methodist kind of nonconforming sort of person. And he's very much speaks out against the nobility and the way that they treat the poor, and he's very much speaks on behalf of the poor in the village and taking their side, and then later on in London, the poor in London, which is all very good, but he definitely has a self-righteous tinge to his character and is very judgmental and very fierce in his opposition to all those he sees as the oppressors. And that can cloud his vision a little bit. So he is who Julia wants to be the hero of the story. And then we have the next most important character is Julia's guardian, who she didn't even realize she had until her mother and who she thought was her father passed away. This all happens at the very beginning of the story, so it's not a spoiler. So the person she thinks is her father has passed away, and then her mother passes away, but she doesn't realize that that was actually her stepfather and that she has a guardian. But she doesn't know who this guardian is. She's never met them, and they kind of control her life from afar. And later on, she will meet this person, and it is a very difficult relationship. So that's all I'll say about her guardian for now. Then there is the villain in the story. For now, I'll just call him the villain. I won't give him a name. And she falls in with him because it seems like her plan to get together with Edward is completely failing. And she needs a backup plan because otherwise her guardian is going to send her off to live in Scotland by herself. So she, actually not by herself, but as a companion to this mean old spinster lady and her sister or cousin or whatever. And so she is determined not to be like shuttled away to Scotland and held captive there, basically is what she sees it as in her mind. And she wants to marry Edward. That falls through, so she falls in with the villain, only of course she doesn't realize that he's the villain. So those are all of the main characters in the story. There are several other characters that I'll mention briefly in passing in a minute here. But one other that I wanted to point out is there is a woman who is her mother's childhood friend, Mrs. Wyndham, and you'll meet her at the very beginning of the story. And I just wanted to mention her because she provides a little bit of comic relief in this story. And also she's like Mrs. Bennet's doppelganger. And is hilarious. She is very much drawn like Mrs. Bennet. So there was a little bit of obvious Jane Austen inspiration there with that character. So those are the characters in the story. Except that I forgot the most important one. Isaac. Lord Isaac Dalry. Julia wants Edward to be the hero of her story, but Lord Isaac Dalry is the true hero of this story. He is the adopted son of her guardian, and he is unfailingly kind to Julia. She doesn't always see it as such, but he is. He continually offers her, I think of the lyrics from a song by Matthew West, wave after wave of grace upon grace. He's continually offering her that all throughout the story. She very often treats him abominably. She doesn't understand him, and she doesn't understand what he offers her, but he is continually loving her unconditionally and always trying to, he sees what she can be rather than what she is. In fact, there's a quote from the book that he says to her, "I've always been able to see people as they were intended to be, not merely who they are now, but what their full potential is." And so that's, he sees in Julia what she will be, what she could be, and he treats her as that person, not as she is. And he tries to help her overcome the difficulties that she's facing in her life. She goes through the story, and he tries to teach her how to walk through them with grace, even though she's very resistant to her. And he in the end is the only one, he's the hero of the story. He is the only one who is able to protect her from the villain of the story. So these are the characters. And now let me tell you a little bit about the story and what happens. So Julia, as I said, her parents that she knew to be her parents die, and she's left on her own, a young girl. She's not quite of an age to provide for herself. Even if she could provide for herself, even if she was of an age, she's not in a position to provide for herself. So she needs to get married. However, she does find out that she has a secret guardian who has no interest in meeting her, but has provided for her a home as a companion of a distant relative in Scotland. But she knows this relative to be like a mean kind of person, and she feels like she would be enslaved if she went there. So it becomes the goal of her life to avoid Scotland at all costs. And literally it becomes at all costs. And instead she will pursue security by marrying someone. Plan A is marrying Edward, as I said before. Plan A falls apart. So she ends up, through a series of events, falling in with the villain of the story, obviously not realizing he is the villain. And from that point on, when she makes her choice to well, kind of fancies herself like having fallen in love with this villain in the story, the whole rest of the story is about escaping his clutches. And there's a lot that happens. There are a lot of twists and turns to the stories, and back and forth from one estate to another, and then to London, their townhouse in London, and just trying to just escape the grasp that the villain has on her, the hold that he has on her, and he refuses to let go. And she's always trying to get back with Edward instead, to escape this villain. But no matter what she tries to do and what avenue she takes, she's always stuck. And he still has his like talons on her. So that's the basic storyline. I don't want to say any more because I don't want to spoil anything. But another thing that I do want to mention is the settings in the story are kind of important. There's a lot of feeling associated with each place, and it really builds the story. So it starts out at a little cottage in a small English village, which feels very much like home to her. And it's, you know, it's not rich and fancy. It's just kind of a normal but delightful little cottage kind of place. You know, imagine the vines growing all over it, and a thatched roof, etc. And that's where the story starts out. And to her, that represents her feeling of home. There's also a strong feeling of a place association with the forests and the fields near that home where she met Edward, and where her friend Elizabeth met Edward's brother Henry, and they spent many years as a childhood together. So that kind of like that is like her safe place, because it was the happiest times of her childhood. So she often like thinks of those forests and fields that she played in. And there was an old oak tree that they would play under that was very special to her and has important sense of place to her. And then there is Maplecroft, which is the estate that is owned by her guardian, and to her feels like a very cold, distant place, even though it is magnificent. It's magnificent and it's wonderful and it's wealthy, but it seems far off to her, and she feels isolated there, and she feels lonely in that place. Then there's the villain's home, Eastbourne, which again is magnificent, but it also has obviously a lot of dark secrets. The deeper you go there, there's some decay. One time she gets lost in the halls, and there's, you know, like slime on the walls, you know, like it's moldy, and there's a decrepit old chapel that's at the heart of this kind of dilapidated ruins of a castle, or an old abbey, actually, I think it was. And so at first, all she sees is like the elegance of this reclaimed abbey, but she kind of doesn't see the decay that's there, and always has a little bit of a fascination for her. So then the other place that she spends a lot of time in is her guardian's house in London, which is kind of becomes the second representative of what is home for her, even though she has very mixed feelings about it. But a lot of the story happens there in that place. So that's the setting of the story. I want to go back to the characters for a second, because this story it's almost, but not quite, allegorical. And it's good that it's not strictly allegorical, because I think an allegory can be really very confining, because you're stuck to, like, if each character is symbolizing something and only that something, then it's very difficult to make them act as true people. So it's not strictly allegorical in that sense. No person or character or situation in the story is 100% accurately reflective of something else, not fully representative of something else. It's more like each character and each thing that happens in the story is presenting a facet of some other bigger truth, spiritual truth. And the first time I read through it, I was so engrossed by the story. This is how well done this is. I was so engrossed by the story. I was just reading it for the story and like turning the pages like this and getting to the end, that a lot of the symbolism and the ideas in the story just went right over my head. But then I went back and read it again, and then it was like, how did I not see this before? It's so obvious. And then on subsequent readings, I've noticed a little more each time about what she's really telling in this story. And it's just so beautiful. So Julia represents just a person, any person, a person in their sinful state. And a person, she represents us as humans, because we are stubborn and willful, and we want the things that we can't have, and we go after them thinking that they will give us happiness, and causing trouble all along the way, just going after that one thing. And she is very hard to like throughout this story, but she is very well drawn. Like, none of us would find ourselves in the actual situation that she's in, because it's an almost a fantastical kind of story, but not quite, but almost. In fact, I was just watching a YouTube video the other day, I'll link to it below, of a girl who had read this story, and that's how she described it, like a fantasy without the fantasy world, set in the real world with, you know, real people and everything, but does have a definite fantasy feel to it. So anyway, she can be very hard to like throughout the story, but that's the whole point. So you have to understand that. And then Edward represents, in my mind, this may be, there's a little room for debate on this, I think, but I feel like many times Edward, being a vicar, he represents obviously Christianity, but kind of a self-righteous kind of Christianity, a Christianity that's relying heavily on his own goodness and his own works, and a Christianity that's very judgmental, except of Julia. So that's where there's an exception. So he very wholeheartedly loves Julia, and she loves him very wholeheartedly, and they have since they were children. But there's definitely an element of self-righteous, judgmental aspect of his character. And so then you have her guardian, her mysterious guardian, who is kind of representative of God, but as people often see him, as a God who is far off and distant, unapproachable, holding everybody to an impossible standard that they couldn't ever hope to reach. That's how Julia feels with him. She feels like she can never reach him. She can never connect to him. She can never have a relationship with him because he's holding her up to the standard that's impossible for her to reach, and she can't reach it. And so she gets so frustrated and she's so hurt throughout the story because she wants to have a relationship with him and she wants to be loved by him, but she never feels it. So it's not, like I said, it's not like a full representation of who God actually is. It's how we, in our sinful minds, perceive him to be. And then the villain is obviously, everybody's villain, which is the devil, right? He is handsome. He is charming. He, at the beginning, there is always a little part of Julia, I think, that understands that he's very dangerous, but she believes what he says. And he's able to seduce her into thinking that he only cares about her well-being and that he will provide security for her. He will give her everything she wants. And he kind of lures her into his trap and tricks her into falling for him. In short, he seduces her with, thoughts of being loved and with thoughts of wealth and provision and security for the rest of her life and protection. He tries to tell her that her guardian, it was going to kill her if she went to Scotland, which was just a lie, but she didn't know that because she didn't know her guardian. And so he turns her against her guardian by introducing thoughts in her mind about him that were not true. Sound familiar? So then everybody's favorite character in the story is Isaac. And let me tell you a little bit about Isaac, and I'll let you decide who Isaac represents. You probably already figured it out. So Isaac is the adopted son of her guardian, and he from the beginning does everything he can to help Julia. He becomes like a stable rock in her world that is like constantly shifting and constantly dangerous. He's like stable, and he's stable because one, he's just a person with calm and steadfast, and he also is just unconditionally loving in his handling and treatment of her. And he also serves as a kind of intermediary between her and her guardian, and tries to assist them to connect with each other, because he knows her guardian very well, and he wants her to love him as much as he does. And so he's always trying to connect them and trying to smooth the waters between them. And he's always going to her guardian and trying to smooth things over for her and to help him forgive her for various things, whatever. So you can probably guess who Isaac represents. So over all the themes of this story, are the overall theme is redemption, but beyond that, the title of the trilogy is called The Price of Privilege. And by the end of the story, Julia, as she's looking back as a very wealthy woman. And I won't tell you, how that transpires, but she's looking back as a very wealthy, privileged woman. But it wasn't an easy path that led her there. So there is a price to her privilege. But at a greater level, at the symbolic level, what we're looking at here is the privilege of being in Christ, the privilege of being a Christian, the privilege of being a believer, and the cost that it was, the price that was paid for it. And not only the price that had to be paid for it on our behalf, but the price that we pay as believers, which, of course, Jesus did all of the hard work. He did the sacrifice. He died for us. But there is a surrender involved in our part, a surrender of our human will. And those are the main themes of this story: surrender and sacrifice. And that the cost of, or the price of privilege, is sacrifice and surrender. So that is some of the things that I have been thinking a lot about this story and just dwelling on, and the things that I really love about this story. And that brings me to the end of this spoiler-free part, because there are a couple really important things to talk about in this story. And I just can't finish the discussion without talking about them. So all of the people who think that you may want to read this story, don't watch the rest of the video, because I don't want to spoil it for you. So don't watch the rest. If you have never read it and have no intention of ever reading it, go ahead and watch. If spoilers don't bother you, but you might read it, don't watch. If you have read it already, please watch, and then please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, maybe don't read the comments if you don't want to be spoiled. Okay, got all that out of the way? All right, so I'm gonna take a little sip of my coffee, give y'all a minute. Are they gone? Can we talk spoilers now? So, yes, it's not your imagination. Different clothes, different lighting, later the same day. So, spoilers. There are two events in the story in particular that I want to mention towards the end that directly correlate to the themes of sacrifice and surrender being necessary for redemption. So I need to give a little bit of background. So now I'm going to give some of the characters' names. The villain is Macy. Macy is like the lord of the underworld of London at the time. He's like, he's got all of the justice system and the police system, whatever, in his back pocket, because he has bribed them all, not bribed, blackmailed them all. He is fabulously rich. He's a crime lord. He's got everybody under his thumb. And so he is pitted against Julia's guardian, who is actually her biological father. So she was born out of wedlock. And he is her biological father. And he is like very high up in the government, has high position in parliament, is well respected. He's also extremely wealthy. And so these two are pitted together against each other, fighting over Julia. Well, they're not really fighting over Julia. They're more fighting to gain mastery over the other for different reasons. And they're also fighting over property. So, and Julia is kind of part of that. She's just a pawn, really, especially for Macy, the villain. Not as much for her father, but definitely for Macy. Her father actually had wanted to send her to Scotland. Presumably, this is never really thoroughly discussed, but presumably in part to protect her from Macy, because he knew that Macy would go after her to get to him. And he felt like, I think that it was part of her protection to get her out of England, the safety of Scotland, a remote area. There's so much in the story that Julia doesn't know, that just is little piece revealed a little bit at a time. And she doesn't really know what's going on. She doesn't understand. And she doesn't know who to trust, but she doesn't really trust anyone but herself, but she really shouldn't trust herself because she makes the most horrible decisions the whole way through the series, and it's very annoying and irritating. It comes to the point when, so she ended up marrying Macy, but from the very beginning, the marriage was in question as to its legitimacy and was never consummated. So, and almost immediately, her father snatches her from Macy's house and takes her out of that situation. So, she never actually lives as Macy's wife. So, then there's like this, they have to figure out this plan, to permanently keep her away from him. And so they essentially just decide to proceed as if the marriage was invalid, even if it's not proven invalid at that point, because they don't want to get like tangled in a legal battle with Macy. So they just kind of proceed forward with it. So her father's plan is for her to marry Isaac, and Isaac wants to also, but Julia is very insistent, like I said, on marrying Edward. Edward is her obsession. She wants Edward, and refuses to do anything else, refuses to consider the possibility of anything else, even though she had agreed to marry Macy, but that was when she thought Edward wasn't a possibility. Then Edward comes back into her life. In the end, she does marry Edward, but their joy is extremely short-lived, because as soon as Macy knows that has happened, he sets in motion a way to get her back. And he's not a nice man, so it's not, he pretends to be very nice to her always. In every interaction with her, he comes across as being caring, whatever. But there's also, and he lies straight to her face, and she never quite knows what to believe. Like I said, she doesn't really know who to trust. Eventually, things come to a head when Macy decides to sue her father and her, I think her suit is one of bigamy. And part of the whole thing is they have to settle legally once and for all, is she married to Macy or not? And so a lawyer friend of Isaac's comes to help. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on, but we'll keep it short as we can. So a lawyer friend comes to help with the case, and he's like walking through Julia through her entire life and puts like a whole timeline on the wall of everything in her life. And it's like she sees all of her bad decisions surrounding her. And so he is representing the law and what the law does to bring us to Christ, right? And so she is just surrounded by the guilt and the shame of the horrible choices she has made, because she made horrible choices the whole way through. And she's just confronted with them. And that is all part of the process of drawing her to Christ. But then there was one particular moment in this process of the interrogation that the lawyer is doing, and figuring out the whole timeline and the storyline, whatever, so they know what to do with their case, when an offhand comment from the lawyer, who was a good friend of Isaac's, reveals that back at the point when her guardian wanted, or her father wanted to send her to Scotland, at that same time Isaac had planned a hunting trip to Scotland, and the hunting lodge that he had rented was right next to the property where Julia would have been staying. And so it's one of those, like, when your life flashes before your eyes moments, except that this was the life she could have had that flashes before her eyes. And she realizes that if she had just trusted and gone to Scotland and like trusted in God to work out all of the plans, if she had just surrendered back at that point, if she had surrendered her will back then she would have met Isaac and would have avoided all of the things that had happened in this whole story. Now, then, of course, we wouldn't have a book, right? But she realizes, and it just hits her all of a sudden, what it cost her not to have surrendered back at point A when she had the first opportunity. And then she had multiple opportunities after that to surrender, and she didn't. And it is a very crucial moment in the story. And that's at that point, like there were other things that happened, other events that took place, but this was kind of like culminating. And at that point, she's just broken, truly broken. And she realizes that she has all along just been stubbornly doing her own thing and her own will. Whereas if she had surrendered way back there, her life would have turned out far differently and significantly better than it was at this point. So that is a huge moment. And that's when, you know, the huge moment of the theme of surrender. Fast forward to the actual trial and everything that's going on. Interestingly, according to the lawyer, and I'm not quite sure that all the legal stuff was really accurate in this book, just put that out there. England's laws on marriage can be a little confusing, especially like they change a little bit during different time periods. So I'm not really sure it was really accurate the way it was dealt with. But anyway, according to the book, the lawyer tells her that actually she wasn't legally married to anybody, neither Macy nor Edward. So, however, he said it's impossible to prove in court just due to the situation of Macy being the crime lord and all of the things. So, however, he's still hopeful that they can win the case, but they don't. So she's accused of being a big, well, basically her marriage to Macy is declared valid by the courts. So she has to go home with him. But they make arrangements that first she will be taken home so that she can, you know, pack and prepare or whatever. And then Macy will come there to collect her and pick her up. So this is the whole reason to read this story. And I'm going to give you one more chance to exit now, because you don't want this to be spoiled if you have any intention of reading the book. So another little sip here. So she goes back to their London house, and she, a few different things happen. She's crying. She knows she needs to pack, but she can't like collect her brain. So Isaac just takes her and here, let's go sit and read. Let's relax and calm down for a little bit. You can worry about all that other stuff later in a minute. Just sit here, just relax. And so he gives her something calming to drink, and then she relaxes with him and she's able to fall asleep. And then when she wakes up, all she can hear is people crying. And she goes to find out what happened, and everybody in the house is sobbing, including all of the maids, all of the footmen, everyone. Everyone is sobbing. And she goes to, I guess the library or whatever, where Isaac had met with Macy. And first she sees Macy lying dead on the floor. And then she sees Isaac lying also dead on the floor. And what she finds out later, what had happened, is that he realized through a series of events, he realized that basically the only way to get rid of Macy, okay, let me just tell you real quick. So a former associate of Macy's had kind of defected and was in hiding or whatever. He managed to make contact with Isaac, and he said to Isaac to, he gave him a vial of poison and said, give this to Julia, and when she is with Macy, she needs to put it in his food. He only trusts the food in his house. He won't eat anywhere else unless someone else also partakes of the food themselves. So he will only trust the food served to him in his house. She needs to sneak it into his food there. Isaac did not want to give that responsibility to Julia. He didn't want her to also add the crime of murder to her list of crimes that she was tried for. And he didn't want Macy to find that vial on her and to, do something worse to her. So he didn't want to put that responsibility on her. So he knew the only way to get Macy to eat or drink something with the poison in it was to do it if he also took it himself. And no, he didn't try to do the whole Princess Bride, you know, switcheroo or slowly help himself to, you know, adjust to the poison or whatever. He didn't have time for that. So couldn't go that route, sadly. So he prayed about it and he got counsel about it. And he asked God to kind of to give him a sign. And so this has already been too much. The sign is, that's another part about the story that I really like, but we'll just move on. Anyway, and so he determines that it's the right way to handle it. So you can quibble about the morality or the ethics or the rightness or wrongness of that decision. It's not the point. The point is that he sacrificed himself for Julia. That's the whole point. And that is what completely redeems her. And that is what literally saves her life. That is like the final step in her redemption process that she has been ongoing throughout this whole story. And it is what truly heals her as a person, and what truly ultimately saves her from her enemy, who is Macy. It was the only way to get rid of him, to eliminate him from her life. So it is such a beautiful story of redemption. And I think that what I love most about this book is how beautifully Christ is portrayed in the character of Isaac. Now, I'm saying it's not an allegory. Not everything he does and everything he says is supposed to be Jesus. He's just represented like a facet of who Jesus is and what he does. And namely in his unconditional love for Julia, his constant forgiveness of her all the time, and in the way he becomes like her rock, her solid rock foundation that she leans on for everything by the end of the story, and in the way that he ends up saving her from the her arch enemy and rescues her from that. So it's just so beautiful. And I think that is the importance of and the power of a story, to kind of push back that veil so that you can kind of catch a glimpse of eternal things, of better things. And in this case, we can't always understand the love of Jesus. I know Jesus loves me. I've sung the song since I was little, right? Yeah, I know. But when you see it in a story, it opens your eyes a little bit more to it. And then you can see it more in your daily life. And I think that's what really makes it so powerful. What makes this story so powerful for me, and why I love it so much. And also why I think it's better to come across that ending yourself. So I was so careful with the spoilers. So if you made it this far and you listened and you haven't read the book yet and you want to read the book, I gave you every chance I could. I really did. I promise. So anyway, thank you for watching if you made it this far. And I really appreciate it. And I would love to hear any and all thoughts that you may have. Like, if you want to say a spoilery sort of comment, maybe just make one regular comment that's not a spoiler, and then reply to your comment and then put like maybe a spoiler ahead of it, so we can keep it a spoiler-free space for the people who are concerned about that. So anyway, thanks for watching, and make another Deep Thoughts video at some point. Probably, hopefully, maybe not as long as this one. Yeah, I'm not gonna make any promises.